let's dive in. Today we're looking at something pretty fundamental, something we all deal with every day, food.
Yeah, definitely.
You send over some fascinating stuff from the Truth on Your Plate podcast. So
Yeah,
we're going to try to unpack some of the big arguments around modern agriculture and, well, what it all means for us, really.
absolutely. And I think, what's interesting about this particular excerpt is we really see this back and forth, this dynamic between
Yeah,
the two hosts, Amina and Sam.
right.
And Amina, she brings up a lot of concern about conventional farming, and
Yeah.
Sam's a bit more on the skeptical side.
Right. He kind of pushes back a little.
Yeah, exactly. And it creates this really interesting tension that I think is worth exploring.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think if you've ever, like, looked at a tomato at the supermarket
Yeah,
and wondered if it's as good for you as it used to be,
right.
or if you're just trying to make sense of, like, all the talk about pesticides and herbicides and all that stuff, this
Absolutely.
deep dive definitely for you. So,
Yeah.
one of the first things the podcast jumps into is this idea of whether our food has actually lost some of its nutritional value.
Right.
Like, is the food we're eating today as nutritious as it was, say, 50 years ago?
Yeah, and Amita really makes the argument that modern farming, with its emphasis on high yields,
Yeah.
often through growing the same crop over and over again, which is what they call monoculture,
Okay.
this can actually deplete the soil.
Interesting.
Think of it, like a pantry. If you just keep taking out the same ingredient and you never replenish it,
Right.
eventually you run out of other essential things, right?
Makes sense, yeah.
And this kind of lack of diversity in the soil can actually mean that the food that ends up on our plates is, well, less nutritious.
I see. Okay, and then, of course, there's the whole issue of pesticides,
Right.
which they bring up glyphosate as a specific example. What are, like, the main worries people have about that?
Well, Amina, she's particularly worried about the potential impact of these chemicals on our health and also,
Uh-huh.
on the environment as a whole.
Yeah,
Now, Sam, he does point out that, science plays a role in ensuring safety,
sure.
but I think the underlying concern is that these substances, they're designed to kill pests, right?
Yeah,
But they might also be having unintended consequences for us
right.
and for the ecosystems where they end up.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then, this leads them into this idea of regenerative farming,
Right.
which they kind of present as a possible alternative, a possible solution. So,
Yeah.
what's like the short version of what regenerative farming is all about?
So essentially, regenerative farming is about actively improving soil health.
Okay.
So that means things like planting a variety of crops,
Mm-hmm.
minimizing how much you disturb the soil, so no-till farming is a big part of that,
Gotcha.
and also using cover crops. So the idea is that healthy soil, it's not just about growing food.
Right.
It's actually a living ecosystem.
Hmm.
And that can then lead to, crops that are more resilient, they're more nutrient rich,
Yeah.
and it can even help with things like storing carbon. So it's almost like
Interesting.
trying to work with nature rather than just, constantly taking from it.
I see. Okay, so now it's interesting because it's not all one-sided in the podcast, right?
Yeah,
Sam brings in this more skeptical viewpoint.
right, right.
So, what are some of the questions that he raises?
Well, he kind of pushes back against this idea that, modern agriculture is just inherently bad.
Right.
He questions whether the fears around it are always based on, solid scientific evidence.
Uh-huh.
And he really emphasizes how incredibly efficient current methods are
Yeah.
at feeding such a huge global population.
Yeah.
And he's a bit cautious about whether we can actually scale up these alternative methods
Hmm.
without, some pretty significant trade-offs.
Interesting. Okay, so another point they bring up in the podcast is this link between soil health and a potential future food crisis.
Right.
And that sounds pretty scary.
It is a serious concern, yeah. And Amina especially is, really vocal about this.
Yeah.
The argument is that if we keep degrading our soil
Yeah.
through these intensive farming practices,
Right.
then eventually its ability to produce food effectively is going to be seriously compromised.
Mm.
And even Sam, he seemed to acknowledge that, yeah, there are real risks associated with soil degradation when he's presented with certain evidence.
I see. So at the end, the Truth on Your Plate mentions some things that individuals can actually do.
Yeah,
Like choosing organic produce, maybe even starting their own garden.
right.
What's the thinking behind that?
So those are presented as ways for people to take some control, I guess,
Yeah,
and support a food system that they feel better about, more confident in.
sure.
Buying organic is seen as a way to encourage farming practices that avoid, those synthetic pesticides and fertilizers.
Right, right.
And then growing your own food, well, that's kind of the ultimate transparency, right?
Yeah.
Because then you know exactly how your food is being produced.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, okay, in this quick deep dive into the truth on your plate, we've talked about a lot, right?
We have, yeah.
We've got concerns about whether our food is as nutritious as it used to be.
Yeah,
This whole debate around pesticides and herbicides,
right.
the potential of this regenerative farming idea.
Hmm.
We heard some skeptical counter-arguments,
Yeah,
and we talked about how crucial soil health is to everything,
absolutely, yeah,
and even some things that people can maybe think about doing themselves.
yeah.
So, hopefully now you've got a pretty good overview of the different angles
Right.
that they presented in that podcast.
Yeah, and it brings up a really interesting question for all of us, for all of our listeners, really.
Yeah.
Given all these different viewpoints on how our food is grown,
Right.
what responsibility do you think you have as an individual consumer? How much can you actually influence the future of our food system?
That's a good question. Yeah.
And, where can you go to actually find reliable information
Yeah,
so you can form your own opinions about these really important issues?
absolutely.
That's the big question.
Yeah. Food for thought, right?
Literally.
All right. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.